In the early morning of 6 June 1944, after a year of preparation, Allied troops invaded beaches in Normandy in France as part of Operation Overlord, the grand plan for the liberation of Western Europe and the defeat of the German army. Almost 5,000 landing craft carried nearly 160,000 men from England and landed them on the beaches of Normandy. At least 4,100 of them lost their lives that day. I'll discuss this preparation of D-Day, the operation itself, logistics, and its aftermath with Paul Camish and Commander Macmillan.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely.
We shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. We'll defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end.
This day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. For the enemy is strong, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Welcome to Skeptic Haven, Commander Macmillan, Paul Camish. Thank you for joining me. Can you give in a few short words, who you are, what your interest in D-Day and the invasion is?
Sure. I'm Lance Macmillan. I am a retired U.S. naval officer, 25 years in service. I attended the U.S. Command and Staff College, the U.S. Naval War College. I've been interested in military history and military affairs basically since I was, like 5 or 6 years old. My interest in D-Day is simply part of that extensive knowledge of military history.
Thank you.
And I'm Paul Camish. I'm also retired military. I was in the Green Howards Infantry Regiment for 15 years, serving from 1986 till 2001. And my interest in the D-Days is one of our regiments was present on that day, and one of our soldiers received the highest commendation actually given on D-Day. So that's my interest in D-Day. It's part of my military history.
Yeah. For me, my interest in D-Day lies more in, my nation had very little, very small role in the invasion itself. Dutch forces didn't land in Normandy until August. By then, Paris was already liberated.
Yes, but there were Dutch naval units present in the invasion force.
Yes, I hope to come back to that a bit. And before I forget, the little intro film was created by Justin Yoon. In the description, you'll find a link to their channel. Okay, I mentioned that the preparation for D-Day started in 1943, the year before the invasion. I think it's useful to give a slight impression on the strategic situation around the invasion. Can you do it, Commander?
Well, you're slightly in error. The first planning for a cross-channel invasion began in 42 with Operation Sledgehammer's planning. The decision was made at that point not to go forward because there were simply too few Allied forces to conduct such an operation. Serious discussion for a 43 operation called Operation Roundup were considered, but again, forces were considered inadequate for the invasion. Also, the bulk of the amphibious transports were tied up in the Mediterranean conducting the invasions at Salerno and Anzio.
Yeah. I mean, as from what I remember reading about, is that large part of, well, it was of course the military preparation, getting the men in England, getting landing craft. I mean, something like 5,000 landing craft were.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
And even something like another 1,000 naval vessels, like from battleships to destroyers to MTBs. It was a giant operation.
No, massive. Technically, more troops were put ashore in the initial landings in Sicily, but the invasion fleet itself and the extent of the highly complex operation for Overlord was bigger. I think you need to also go through all the preparatory phases that led up to the invasion. So, for example, you need to consider the whole deception efforts to convince the Axis that we weren't going at Normandy, that we were going at the Pas-de-Calais. That's Operation Bodyguard and Fortitude. Fortitude was actually the creation of entirely fictitious army groups with, phony uniforms and patches and units that didn't really exist, and extensive radio traffic to convince the Germans that there was a much larger force in, I'll get the provinces wrong, but the northern part of England to the northeast of London, stationed up there preparing for this giant cross-channel assault.
And me and Helen was also discussing earlier before we started recording about the deceptions that they used. And there was one story, I can't remember the full of it. I can't remember it all, but you might have where there was, I believe it was a homeless guy that had died on the streets in England, and they took his body, dressed him in a suit, give him a leather briefcase, put papers in the briefcase, which was a deception, and then dropped his body off so that they had an idea of where the body would land ashore, and basically it all worked. So, I mean, the deception was unbelievable, how deep it actually went. And I found that story, I'll have to try and find it again. It's absolutely fascinating to listen to. Yeah,
although that particular operation, Mincemeat, is part of the Sicily landings, not Overlord.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but that is part of what they were doing. They had extensive contacts with the French underground and targeting targets to, again, further that impression that it was another site. So pretty much Normandy was not touched by Allied bombing efforts prior to the landings. It was not touched by French resistance efforts prior to the landings. All of that was concentrated, again, up in the the Pas-de-Calais area to give the impression, yeah, we're planning to attack here. Look at all the preparatory bombardment that's preceding all this.
Yeah, and this gets us onto the inflatable tanks.
Oh yeah.
That they had, and from the air when the reconnaissance was coming over, they were looking at all the exactly.
I love that picture.
I mean, the amount of detail they've gone to even putting the number on the side, which obviously from a reconnaissance point of view, or an aeroplane flying over, you could probably get away with not putting that on. But they even went to that level of detail just in case. You'd be totally fooled by that. You know, you're traveling at 300-400 miles an hour in an aircraft. Even if you're at 500 feet, 300 feet, coming past that, you are not going to distinguish that from the real thing. Just impossible.
Oh, yeah. Now, I've always found fascinating is that the deception operations leading up to D-Day were, from everything we know, successful. But there were also deception operations that were to occur on D-Day itself to continue to get the Germans to think that that's where the invasion was going. So there were phony convoys, actually small coastal vessels, but they were towing radar reflectors and, you know, transmitting signals on dozens of different frequencies to make it look like a giant invasion force was there. And all the indications are that those three operations, which are called Taxable, Glimmer, and Big Drum, all of those were failures. The Germans almost immediately knew that they were phony.
Right, but thankfully, the Germans, even when they started mounting the offensive on the beaches, they were convinced that was a deterrent to the invasion, the real invasion that was still going to take place in Calais.
Yeah, it was a feint.
They were still convinced that that's where the main invasion force was, and this was basically a deterrent. What didn't they? And by the time they realised it was
that confusion lasted for probably a critical 4 to 5 days at OKW, Oberkommando West, the German headquarters. They were convinced that the thing that's going in Normandy, it's a feint. They're going to pull out in a week or two, and they were still waiting for the other shoe to drop, and of course it never did.
Yeah. I mean, I seem to remember that the Germans kept several panzer divisions stationed near Calais, while they could have driven to Normandy, but never did.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things is that the initial German response was pretty much local, just the troops that were in and around Normandy to the initial landings. And the only 3 German mobile formations that arrived within basically the first week were all fairly close to the landing site. The bigger ones didn't arrive for like a week and a half, 2 weeks. And I think that gave the Allies that critically needed gap period where they weren't getting hit by the full might of the Wehrmacht to establish a secure lodgment on the continent and then start building up.
Yeah, and I mean, from that point of view, of course, I mean the 100,000 something men who landed the first day were just the beginning. I mean, after that, many more men were shipped to the beachhead, and of course, a considerable operation in logistics, in all kind of stuff an invasion force needs.
I mean, obviously the logistics side is just as important as the invasion side, because if you get the invasion side right, but you get the logistics side wrong, it isn't going to be long before you're going to get pushed back. So logistics is absolutely critical in any military operation. You've got to get the logistics right, and it's like anything. I mean, if you're taking on an enemy and you're wanting to demoralize them, if you're struggling to take them on man to man, if you can disrupt their logistics side so they're not getting the food and water that they require, you can demoralize them massively. So logistics is a very important part of any invasion.
And I think that's a great segue to talk about some of the early logistics planning that went into all this, not just the invasion convoy routing itself, which was immensely complicated because trying to deconflict the movements of over 5,000 ships, as you can imagine, is an adventure. But I'm referring.
Don't you? Just a quick one though. Don't you find that I think a lot of people don't realise the logistics side of this type of thing, because when you're watching films and things like that, it never goes into, or very rarely goes that deep into it.
Logistics ain't sexy.
Fair enough. But it's, you can't underestimate the logistics side. You lose that, you lose the battle.
Exactly. So I think, if we're going to talk about that, the key one that we really need to talk about first are the Mulberry harbors. And that's actually a misnomer, because the Mulberry is simply part of a much larger planned operation. There are block ships that are sunk outside that. There's a barrier, floating barrier that breaks up the surface waves, and then a whole series of other things that come in. And then they sink these giant floating concrete pylons down to the seabed to create that artificial harbor and to create causeways that go ashore that they can bring vehicles in. And they needed to do this because the planners realized that even with the most ridiculously optimistic estimates, it was going to be roughly a month before they secured a significant harbor to start landing all those follow-on supplies. And they needed some way to bring it in. So they created this very elaborate and fairly successful floating harbor. And
2 of them.
Pardon?
2 of them.
Well, yeah. And the other part of that I think is important to understand is how successful it was, because parts of it are still out there.
Yeah.
You know, here we are 80 years downstream, and these concrete blocks of the harbor are still sitting off the coast of Normandy. So they were very substantial structures that did their job quite impressively. There was also Pluto, which admittedly didn't get operational until later in July. But Pluto it's actually an acronym for Pipeline Under the Ocean. And the idea was they were going to lay these pipelines from Britain to pump petroleum products across the channel under the water on the seabed into the Normandy Peninsula to keep those forces supplied. That way you didn't have to figure out elaborate ways to transport barrels and barrels and barrels of fuel for the equipment.
Were they successful in doing that? Or was that just a plan?
Oh, no, it was put in place. The key hold up to the whole thing was securing Cherbourg, because that was the planned location to establish the continental terminus of the Pluto pipeline. And until that was secured, they couldn't bring it ashore. They needed facilities that were resident in Cherbourg to bring it in. But before Cherbourg port itself was operational to bring in forces, they were already bringing in petroleum products through the pipeline there.
Yeah, that's impressive, because I was just thinking, the first thing that comes to my mind is how many thousands or millions of gallons it would take just to fill the pipeline before you actually get one drop out.
Before you get the first drop on the beach.
Yeah, how much have you actually pumped in to get that distance before you even get 1 gallon out of the other end? I mean, that's absolutely amazing.
It is.
They managed to do that 80 years ago. That is incredible. Yeah.
I mean, it's technology that even today is still kind of young.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, from the UK, how much pressure have you got at that end to push that through? Just the amount of pressure you'll need to push that amount of liquid through a pipe must be absolutely incrediable.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I don't know the exact technique of how that works. It was not like let's say the water mains. So it's all liquid. There are compartments with solid plugs in between. How they exactly are moved, I don't know, by the way.
I honestly don't know. I haven't really looked at the details that closely. I know using the modern U.S. Navy equivalent, which is OPDS, or Offshore Petroleum Distillate or Distribution System, we only calculated being maybe 3 to 5 miles offshore. And even that required a special ship with a special high-purpose pump to be able to move that liquid.
Yeah.
In this case, you're talking probably, 80, 100 miles to get to Cherbourg from Britain.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was...
be over 100 miles, I think.
I'm just guessing. I don't have a map.
No, I don't. I'm trying to think where. It's got to be. Yeah, I think it'll be over 100 miles. But I mean, even if it's 80 miles, I mean that's incredible.
Oh yeah, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
I think another, and it's not exactly logistical, but it is part of the establishing plans to make the operation possible. I don't think you can talk about D-Day without talking about Operation Point Blank, which is...
Just before we go on to that, Raymond's just put in the private chat that the distance is actually 146 miles in a straight line.
Well, it didn't go in a straight line. Yeah.
So that is actually incredible. Yeah, that is 146 miles.
I think they powered it with Churchill's ego. Oh, that's brilliant.
I'll have to stop reading the private
with
chat.
Montgomery's ego as a backup plan. It's very impressive. Operation Point Blank is the air supremacy plan. And I think that's critical because without having absolute Allied air supremacy over the area, I don't think the operation would have been even possible, let alone as successful as it was.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think at this point, the German Navy had been vastly depleted. They still had a German Navy, and like you said, the air support, the German Air Force was vastly depleted to what it was. So it was probably the right time to do it. If they'd tried to do it 2 or 3 years earlier, I don't think we'd have had a chance. The air support was just too great. But at the time we did it in 44, it was just at the right time.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I don't know if your audience has seen it, but Netflix has Masters of the Air, which is all about the Air Force daylight bombing campaign. And we can't ignore the fact that the British nighttime bombing campaign was equal as important. But everybody's sense is that that's all about bombing German industry so it can't continue to produce war material. That was secondary. The real plan there was that the bombing campaign of the German heartland would require them to bring all their aircraft home to defend the Reich, leaving the French beaches pretty much naked of any kind of air defense.
Yeah.
And also at the same time by introducing attacks on German airfields, all the fighter aircraft, that was to continue to whittle it down. And as I think you guys probably know, the entire Luftwaffe reaction to what happened on D-Day was 2 fighter planes making a single strafing pass on, I think it was Sword Beach. That was it.
Yeah. There was basically none, was there? There was basically no air support whatsoever from the Germans.
Yeah. So it goes back to the discussion earlier of the idea of sledgehammer and Roundup. They've been thinking about this for so long, and they thought out everything they needed to do, all the plans to make this a reality. That includes Point Blank and all the other stuff. And I think that's a key part of this to understand is the amount of operational planning and even scientific planning, developing things like the mulberries, the funny tanks, etc., to make this possible. It took that long, 2 years, to make this a reality. You can't undersell that.
Nope. And how, I mean, from what I read in Wikipedia, always reliable, the operational planning started in 43. Is that correct?
The initial strategic level planning was in 42, where they were thinking about where should we go, where should we land. 43, you get Dieppe, and Dieppe in some ways is a proof of concept as much as it is anything else about, can we actually put an invasion force on the beach for a short period? Can it survive getting ashore? The terrible reality is we massacred a good portion of an entire Canadian infantry division to prove that, well, going into the Pas-de-Calais area is not a bright move. Let's not do that. Because up until that point, everybody serious was thinking it's the shortest way across the channel. That's where we should go. And it was at that point.
But also, that's what your enemy's going to think as well, which
exactly
is what they did do. And yeah, I believe you're correct that it was initially started, the planning stage was 2 years prior. But it's like anything, whenever you're planning anything, the first stage is you're not doing a great deal. That's your initial planning. So that's where you get your idea. And then as you're getting closer to the day, to the actual day, that's when things start pumping up. So 6 months, 8 months prior to it, that's when all the work, the real work, would have been really banged into it. A year before, a bit less, 2 years. That's where the ideas came from. So yeah, I'm in agreement that yeah, it was certainly 2 years from start of the planning to actually happening was 2 years.
It's also worth noting that there were other invasion sites considered, not just Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. Brittany was briefly considered. It was rejected largely because they figured out that it wouldn't take much for the Germans to simply build a defensive line at the top of the Brittany Peninsula, and great, you have a large self-supporting prisoner of war camp. They also considered going into the Atlantic side of France. I can't remember the names of the ports down there, but that was considered. And one of the primary reasons they decided not to go is many of the smaller amphibious craft couldn't make that transit safely if they were loaded with the invasion forces. So it kind of ended up, yeah, the logical place to go if you went through all that planning cycle was Normandy. And I always found it curious that Normandy was never realistically identified by the Germans as the likely site.
Why is that? I mean,
I don't know.
Presumably the Germans knew what you just said.
Yeah, you would think.
I mean, I would think it's probably due to the fact that it's you're going to think that they're going to go to the least distance to get there, which is why obviously Calais was basically the obvious place, but it's obvious for both sides, so you don't want to do what's obvious to them. But I think that there is probably a bit too far. They probably wouldn't have felt they would be able to get the infrastructure to actually travel that distance and support them, which is where the logistics came into it. Exactly. And also the shorter distance you're having to travel, as much as the weather plays a part in it, it's not as important. Whereas if you're traveling that distance, the Met Office and the weather reports, because it was delayed for a couple of days, wasn't it? It was due to happen about the 3rd or the 4th of June. Yep. Due to the severe weather, it got postponed till the 6th. And even then, when they did it on the 6th, the weather was vastly improved from the previous years, but it still wasn't perfect. I know
it was marginal, and Eisenhower very seriously, Eisenhower considered saying, no, we're going to have to wait. And the big problem was that if they delayed it again, it would have to be delayed into July because the lunar conditions didn't match up with what they needed.
Yeah.
Yes. And I know the Americans who had the inflatable, well, not inflatable tanks, the tanks that were like part amphibious, they had like a screen that went round them.
Yeah, the DD tanks.
Yes, and I think they lost about 70% of them before.
Oh, it's higher than that. I think only 3 actually made it to the beach.
Yeah, it's only what I can remember. I know they lost a vast amount of them before they even got to the beach, and that was purely due to the weather conditions and the sea conditions at the time.
Sea was quite choppy, and as I understand it, there still was a strong wind from the west, and that makes landing no fun whatsoever.
Oh yeah, and I think it's worth. I mean, we're transitioning right now into the actual Operation Neptune, which is the initial landings, and it's worth noting, for example, that the landing on Utah Beach, which is the one that's farthest to the west,
Yes.
didn't actually land where it was supposed to. It went ashore almost over a half mile from the actual landing sites it was supposed to, because the currents and the sea state was such that they couldn't make the beach they were supposed to. So they landed off site. And it's notable that at that point, the division commander, I think it was actually the assistant division commander, who was ashore, said, okay, I'm going to call it. We're not going to the original beach, change the entire landing operation here on Utah and land them here. Which I think was a brilliant decision, because if you now divided your troops between, well, we had the assault waves over here and now the follow-on waves over here, you divide your force, you don't have any concentration of effort, things go to hell.
Yep. Yeah, and the airborne forces were also severely hampered by the weather as well, because they all landed in the wrong place, basically.
Especially the 101st Airborne.
Well, I did exactly the same thing. They were supposed to drop behind enemy lines, and they were scattered all over the place. I think it took them more than half the day just for them to regroup back together and actually get to some sort of force again. They were just scattered all over the place.
There's a fascinating map. I wish I talked to you guys about bringing this up earlier. Too hard to find it on the fly, but it shows where each individual stick from the different divisions landed, and some of them are almost in Brittany where they were dropped. That gives you an idea how bad the weather was and how, I hate to say it, how poorly trained the transport pilots were. And I think that's also a contributory factor to why the airdrops were so bad, is that, you know, the best people who came out of flight school got assigned to fighters, the next group to bombers, and then the guys who were like the dregs got assigned to the transport fleet.
Yeah.
With predictable results.
Yeah. I mean, what I seem to remember is that, of course, they jumped by night, which is always a tricky business.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it's noteworthy that after Overlord, they never do a night drop again. All drops are done in the day because of how bad the situation was getting them into Normandy.
Yeah.
Right, so I suppose that brings us to the part now where the troops are actually hitting the beaches. So, what do we think that was like?
I'm sure many people in your audience have seen Saving Private Ryan, and
yes, that's my first thought.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who were in the actual operation in that first assault wave say that is very realistic, that opening scene of them coming across the beach.
Yes, I believe before that film went out, didn't they actually get some veterans to actually watch that scene, to give their input, and that's where they got exactly what you've just said. They say it was very realistic, and just watching it myself, it was. It must have been absolutely horrendous, and we can't forget we are talking about young kids at the time. Most of them have been 19, 20, 21. Certainly, I
think the average age of the troops going ashore was 20, but that's average because you're talking, senior NCOs, officers, everything. But so to drag that down into, from the 17 and 18-year-olds who were in the private ranks, it's horrendous. The thing that I find interesting, though, is most movies of that operation, it's all about troops coming ashore right out of the landing craft and then going up. And in fact, not most, but many of the German defensive emplacements were oriented not to fire straight out to sea. They were oriented to have a enfilading position down the length of the beach. So as the troops crossed the beach, that's when they would get shot up. And that was made worse because the Allied planners had decided to land at low tide. So those guys are running across an expanded length of beach in full view of those weapons. If they'd landed at a high tide, then they would have been able to, run a shorter distance to get into the cover of the bluffs. The reason they did that, though, is because most of those German obstacles you see pictures of that are in the water, the giant caltrops and I can't remember what they're named, but they have they have mines on them. So if a landing craft touches those coming in at high tide, it blows the landing craft up and you get almost everybody aboard killed, as opposed to arguably, half or 2/3 while they're running across that stretch of sand. It's a grim calculus, but I think that figured very prominently into how they were going to do it the way they did.
Would you agree that they probably made the right decision, or do you think that they should have done it in high tide?
I look at it from a modern perspective, and you have to remember they don't have a lot of experience at this point conducting amphibious operations, and certainly not against fortified beaches. Yeah, they did in the Pacific, but that's a whole separate issue because the Marines and the Army really didn't talk to one another very much. There was a lot of inter-service rivalry and animosity there.
They still don't.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still messy. But the key, I think, is that they had no experience of attacking a fortified beach, so they did things the way they did. And using 20/20 hindsight from a modern perspective, I think there were ways they could have conducted the operation at high tide so that they didn't have to, run across that open beach, but also afford some protection by clearing those obstacles out of the landing zones. But it's a trade-off. And given the knowledge and experience they had at the time, I suspect, unfortunately, the low tide solution was the right choice.
Yeah.
So one thing that's not talked about much is what happens after the troops get ashore and what flows from that into the next couple of days. In point of fact, most of the landings did not get off the beach. I mean, yeah, they got off the beach up to the top of the bluffs, but they didn't get much farther inland than that. Most areas, it was the assault landing troops didn't get more than about a mile inland. And I think much of the planning that was done was optimistically thinking that they would get 3-5 miles inland to give them a much larger area to expand into, but also to link up with and reinforce the airborne forces that have been dropped so they could put out a safe perimeter. And I think that's one of the key things you find is that completely safe perimeter really wasn't established on the first day, which is why you get so many incidents of German artillery firing into that very crowded beach area for upwards of a week after the landings.
You might know if I'm correct on this. Didn't the Canadians actually get the furthest inland on D-Day?
One unit in the Canadian forces was one battalion was the only unit to actually achieve its assigned objectives on D-Day itself. Nobody else did.
And now we're on to the actual progressing from the beaches. This is probably a perfect opportunity for me to talk about my side of it. Like I said, I was in the Green Howards, and one of our regiments was there. The 6th Battalion, the Green Howards, was actually there, and they landed on Gold Beach, I believe it was, and there was a guy there called Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis, and he was the first or the only recipient of the Victoria Cross on that day. I can't remember how far they actually made it yet. That's Stanley Hollis, And that's a perfect picture, because if you look at this cap badge here, I've actually got the cap badge from the same period. And that's my old regiment. Obviously, we didn't have this cap badge when I was in. Very similar to this. I should have actually gone and got mine, but that was the same cap badge that Stanley Hollis had on the day. I can't remember how far he managed to get it in. I'll just see if I can see it on the Wikipedia page about him. Right, so the citation that he received, let me just close that down. The citation published in the London Gazette reads, in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, during the assault on the beaches and the Montfrere battery, Company Sergeant Major Hollis, company commander, noticed that 2 of the pillboxes had been bypassed and went with Company Sergeant Major Hollis to see that they were clear. I'll just put my glasses on because I'm struggling to see. See whether they're clear. When they were 20 yards from the pillbox, a machine gun opened fire from the slit, and Company Sergeant Major Hollis instantly rushed straight at the pillbox, firing his Sten gun. He jumped on top of the pillbox, recharged his magazine, threw a grenade through the door, and fired his Sten gun into it, killing 2 Germans and making the remainder prisoners. He then cleared several Germans from the neighbouring trenches. By his action, he undoubtedly saved his company from being fired on heavily from the rear and enabled them to open the main breach exit. Later the same day, in the village of Crepon, the company encountered a field gun and crew armed with Spandaus. I don't know if you know what that is. The Spandaus.
It's a World War I machine gun. Yeah, but the name carried over into World War II, and you see lots of references to Spandau machine guns when what they're really saying is a machine gun.
Right, okay. At 100 yards range, Company Sergeant Major Hollis was put in command of a party to cover an attack on the gun, but the movement was held up. Seeing this, Company Sergeant Major Hollis pushed right forward to engage the gun with a Payat, which I believe is like an anti-tank gun.
The silliest anti-tank weapon you can imagine. It used a car spring to launch the bomb.
No, actually, no. I do know about this. It didn't actually use the car spring to launch the bomb. The car spring was there to absorb the recoil from it.
Really?
Yes, it was actually a mortar.
Oh.
It was devised from the mortar, so they needed something to absorb the recoil, and that's what the spring was. I was just watching a video earlier on today about this because I heard it before.
Fascinating.
Yes, and to do that, they put a large spring in to absorb the recoil.
Yeah.
So anyway, Hollis pushed right forward to engage the gun with a PLAT, which is a personal light anti-tank, something like that.
Projector Infantry
Anti-tank, yeah. From a house at 50 yards range. He was observed by a sniper who fired and grazed his right cheek. And at the same moment, the gun swung round and fired at point-blank range into the house. To avoid the fallen masonry, Company Sergeant Major Hollis moved his party to an alternative position. 2 of the enemy gun crew had by that time been killed, and the gun was destroyed shortly afterwards. He later found that 2 of his men had stayed behind in the house and immediately volunteered to get them out. In full view of the enemy, and who continually fired at him, he went forward alone using a Bren gun to distract their attention from the other men. Under cover of his diversion, the 2 men were able to get back. Wherever fighting was heaviest, Company Sergeant Major Hollis appeared, and in the course of a magnificent day's work, he displayed the utmost gallantry, and on 2 separate occasions, his courage and initiative prevented the enemy from holding up the advance at critical stages. It was largely through his heroism and resource that the company's objectives were gained and casualties were not heavier, and by his own bravery, he saved the lives of many of his men. and that was the citation from the London Gazette, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was something that I wanted to bring up in this because, like I say, this becomes part of my my military history due to the fact that it was from the same battalion as me. And apparently there was quite a few people that I knew that had actually met him. I never met the bloke. I believe he died in about 1971, 1972. But they say he was a very quiet-spoken, reserved gentleman. He was very tall. Apparently he was about 6'4", something like that. He was a very tall man. And when he left the military, he went on to run a pub. I think it was somewhere near Middlesbrough. I know he was from the Middlesbrough area. It might have been somewhere like South Ormsby or somewhere like that he was at. He basically became a publican, and he named the pub the Green Howards. So, and then, like I say, in about 1970s, that's when he sadly passed away. But yeah, I think that was a good story to bring up at this point.
Oh, yeah.
We're on to the beach now, we're moving forward.
I don't know how many medals of honor were issued on the American side.
Well, yeah, but I mean, for those who don't know, the Victoria Cross is the highest award that you can get as a British medal.
I'm aware. Yeah.
And most people that get that usually don't survive. It's usually given posthumously. And I think the Green Howards, I think we had 18 in total that has been awarded to our battalion. We have 18 Victoria Crosses, but this one was the one that was mainly remembered. We always used to remember the Stanley Hollis stories. I couldn't tell you any of the others, to be perfectly fair. It's just Stanley Hollis. That was the main one.
Yeah, read in the side chat that there were 10 medals of honors given for D-Day.
Yeah.
Mm.
So once they get ashore over the next couple of weeks, it's basically fighting to cut across the peninsula and also to send forces up to secure Cherbourg. Cherbourg was considered critical because it was a major port that they thought they needed to get all the supplies across. What they didn't expect or realize was that the Germans basically blew up the port before it was captured. So it took quite a while before they could repair it to the point to start bringing supplies in through there. It was still important, but it was not as critical to the operation as they thought. The majority of the supplies, at least initially, are coming through the beachheads themselves, over the Mulberry and that kind of thing. Then you have that long battle in the hedgerow country with slow advance, and everything's going terribly slowly. The Germans are getting whittled down, but at the same time, the Allies are taking fairly substantial losses. And I think the point where you stop talking about the battle of or for Normandy and you start talking about the rest of the campaign in France is when they launch Operation Cobra, which is the breakout from Normandy. And I think that's kind of the point where we draw the line and don't talk about that on a program that's supposed to be about D-Day.
Yeah.
From the German side, I think one of the things that they were very surprised by was the effect of Allied air power. And again, that leads up to that whole thing we were talking about, Operation Point Blank and such, because they take such heavy losses trying to move forces into the area, getting shot up, strafed, what have you, on the approach routes. One of the divisions, one of the most powerful divisions they had was a division called Panzerlehr, which was the only unit in the entire German army that was completely mechanized, had no wheeled transport. Everything was tracked. And everybody was counting on that to be like, you know, the giant steel fist that would punch through, take, through the Allied lines and take the beaches. It suffered something like 60 to 70% losses of its equipment just getting to Normandy from its assembly areas further away. And that's why air power plays such a critical part. Is almost all the German mobile formations took very significant losses just getting to the operational area.
I'm definitely not an air war person. I know a bit about it, but can you give any idea how much of the RAF and US Air Forces were involved in that?
In about the week to 2 weeks immediately prior to Overlord, and probably for another 2 weeks after the actual landings, virtually the entire Allied focus, Allied air power focus was on supporting those operations in Normandy or preventing German forces from moving into the area. There were a lot of attacks on French transportation centers. And of course, as I'm sure you guys are aware, in World War II, most daylight bombing, was not terribly accurate. So there's tons of collateral damage. I've seen estimates of into the hundreds of thousands of French civilians being killed by Allied bombs that didn't hit their targets. But by bombing the rail centers, it prevented the Germans from moving that stuff by rail, which is important because even if you're moving tanks and such or motor vehicles on the roads, those vehicles are now taking wear and tear, and they suffer breakdowns. And World War II tanks generally were not terribly reliable. For example, the vaunted Russian T-34, it was counted on being able to operate no more than 100 hours before it would suffer a major breakdown and require a complete engine replacement. Many of the German tanks were the same way, and the big problem with the German tanks is they're kind of not really mass-produced so much as individually crafted. So it was really hard to get replacement parts to keep those operational.
You couldn't take parts from another vehicle necessarily that was the same vehicle that had broken down or was destroyed, but the part you required might not necessarily fit your vehicle, even though it's the same one.
Depending on the model. And that's one of the things you see a lot of people, the Allies used the Sherman tank and it was a crappy tank. Look how much better the Tiger or the Panther is. Those are German tanks, the Tiger and the Panther. And yeah, on an individual basis, they are far superior vehicles. But the Allies could produce probably 7-8 times the number of Shermans that the Germans could produce Tigers and Panthers. And they were pretty much interchangeable. So if you had a Sherman A1 or a Sherman A4, the parts in the chassis, the engine, the transmission, etc., were pretty much interchangeable. German tanks, not so much, because depending on which factory had produced them, they had different parts. They weren't completely compatible, different models. And the Germans have dozens of different tanks that they're using in Normandy. So as you can imagine, that complicates that logistical picture of keeping that stuff running. You have to constantly say, well, I need a cam wheel for this model of tank. Well, don't you have others of that tank? No, those are different model. I need this model produced by this factory so I can get this one operational again. So that becomes an issue because with the rail lines out, they can't move them that way. They have to drive them on the road, and you get increased vehicle breakdowns. And in some cases, divisions, German mobile divisions, were arriving at the front with less than 10% of their vehicles operational. The others were either destroyed by Allied air power or strung up back along that road, broken down, waiting for somebody to come and fix them.
Yeah, and I suppose when they arrived, actually at the battle area, they probably were towards the end of their life anyway. So even without getting hit, they were probably close to breaking down. Like you're saying, they only had like roughly 100 hours of time, and if you're spending 80 hours getting there, you've got 20 hours of battle time left if you're lucky. Exactly,
and so you see cases of those vastly superior German tanks in the later fighting, and Operation Goodwood is one. I can't remember all the names of the different operations where Montgomery's trying to take Caen, and you have, a half dozen German tanks sitting on a hill, and the Allies are charging them with 50, 100 tanks, losing most of those tanks attacking to try to take that hill because those tanks are so superior and they're in a better, defensive position up on that hill. They have the high ground. But at the same time, eventually those 6 tanks are going to get knocked out, and there's nothing behind them to replace that because all those vehicles have been destroyed or are broken down. And that's one of the things that I think defines the course of this campaign is while the Allies are taking heavy losses, they can sustain them to a large degree. The Germans can't. They really don't have the replacement forces to draw upon. And at the end, when the Allies start breaking out during Operation Cobra, the German high command realizes there's no way in hell we can continue trying to fight to hold this area. We need to retreat back behind some major, terrain feature, the Seine River, what have you, and regroup and take time to rebuild our forces because the army is basically broken at this point.
Yeah, so they've basically retreated on. They've gone to a defensive strategy rather than an attacking one. Is that what you're
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things a lot of people don't understand is that it's not the Allies storm ashore and then next week they're attacking the Rhine and the week after that they're inside, Germany proper. It's not. It's a long drawn out campaign. It's hard.
It took absolute weeks, didn't it, to get to? Was it something like about? I don't know if I'm right on this. About 6 weeks to get to Paris.
It's longer than that.
Yes,
I think Paris isn't liberated until sometime in mid-August.
Mid-August. I don't know the exact day, but something like that.
Yeah. So, the breakout operation doesn't start until fairly late in June, I believe. Once it gets moving, it moves very rapidly. And if you've seen the movie Patton, it's that famous scene where he's gotten so far ahead, he's outrun his own supply lines, and his troops are kind of dragging the tanks on ropes behind them. But that also goes back to that whole logistical issue that we were talking about, which is Cherbourg had not been secured. They didn't have a port to bring in all those forces and supplies that they needed to keep things rolling. And they're only getting enough to keep one element of the Allied army rolling. And Patton's gotten so far ahead, they're very concerned he's going to be outflanked. So all of Patton's supplies are reallocated to Montgomery to push up to secure his other flank. And you get this whole contest of, Montgomery was incompetent and couldn't progress as fast as he should have. I don't think it was that. I just think it was the planning had not calculated there weren't going to be enough supplies to do everything that everybody wanted.
Yeah. And of course, that's where things like, liberation of Antwerp becomes, a big part in the planning.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's not so much because Antwerp is a huge major port, arguably the largest in Europe at that time. The key was that instead of having to move all the supplies that were coming in at the ports they had secured and drive them all the way across France, by securing Antwerp, they were now much closer for that supply offload point to get the supplies to the troops at the front. And probably half of the supplies that the Allies were landing were actually being consumed in getting the other half of the supplies to the front lines. And people don't realize that. It's
Mm.
it's very important that they had ports that they kept securing as they advanced up, and the Germans began to understand that. And so every time they retreat, they destroy whatever port they were abandoning, and the Allies were back to square one of, well, it's going to take 2 months to repair this port to where we can start landing supplies.
Yep.
Mm.
In that respect, I live in Rotterdam, my hometown, where the Germans, before they moved out in May 45, they ruined the port. It's what they did. Which, by the way, from a military strategic point of view, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it disrupted trade for quite some time after the war.
Yeah. The other thing I think that's interesting to talk about is how tough that fighting in the Normandy hedgerow country was, and all the little innovations that had to be developed to make it something the Allies could succeed at doing. So I think the plan had been, for example, to withdraw the 3 Allied airborne divisions out and take them back to England to refurbish and get them ready to drop into France or Holland or Belgium or whatever later on. And instead, they ended up having to stay in Normandy almost for the duration of the campaign, because they were having so much trouble getting through, and they needed all those bodies to keep fighting. And it sounds strange to say it this way, but it shows the level of desperation that was causing, because training a paratrooper as opposed to training an average infantry soldier is a much longer and costlier proposition. So trying to avoid killing those guys in what is effectively an infantry fight to preserve them for later use is important, but they couldn't do it because they needed riflemen on the front line, and they just couldn't land them fast enough because there was no port to bring them in through. The other thing that you see in the hedgerow country is, and for people who don't know, the hedgerow country covers a large portion of Normandy and also parts of Brittany, and it's small private plots of farmland that are surrounded on all sides by a combination of thick vegetation and heaped up rocks and earth that have been cleared from the field. And you literally couldn't get through this stuff. It was impenetrable. It was the equivalent of a big stone wall in some ways.
Yeah, it is. I can just speak on that for a second. The way
Sure.
it was done, the hedges, I live in the countryside. So the way we grow hedges to separate fields is instead of just letting the hedge grow up, as the hedge grows up, you then snap the branches, bring them over, intertwine them, and then they grow up again, and then you intertwine them, and you do that all the way through. So it's like more like a wicker basket effect.
Yep.
So when it comes to trying to push through it, say with a tank can literally go to one of these hedges, and it's just pushing into like a spring. It just cannot get through it. Whereas a normal hedge that just grows up, you can get a weak point and get through. But due to the way that the edge grows, as it grows up, you bend it or you literally snap it, but it's still attached. So you snap it, that goes down, and then they come up again, and then you snap it and bring it down, and you just keep doing that until you build the hedge up, and it's absolutely impenetrable. You won't get through it. You'll struggle to get through it.
Coupled with the fact that you probably have a 4 or 5 foot tall heap of stone and earth underneath all that. So it's really tough. And one of the expedients they came up with was what they called the rhino attachment, where they created out of sheet metal, basically, these giant plows that they would just drive the tank into the hedgerow, and it would shove the whole thing out of the way. It gave it the leverage that it needed to kind of push the thing out of the way as they drove through. And that was a significant factor getting through the hedgerow country. But realistically, You're literally fighting for each 100 square meter plot one at a time, and getting across each hedgerow is a horrendous task because the enemy is basically entrenched on the opposite side of an open field. So you have to run across the open field against a heavily entrenched enemy, force him out of his hedgerow, and then what's he going to do? He's going to run back to the next hedgerow, and you have to do it all over again.
Yeah, I suppose in Europe it's not like it is in the US, where you've got your vast open plains of fields, and it just, you know, like
and those that do have a delineated border, it's at best a thin wooden fence.
Right. But yeah, all of our fields, you know, in Europe and in the UK are all exactly the same. It's only several hundred meters, and then you've got the next field, and there's either a hedge or a stone wall there, and then again 200 or 300 meters an edge, a stone wall. You don't have vast areas where, you know, even 500-600 meters. It's very rare that happens. There's usually a wall or a hedge that's going to be in your way.
Dutch fields uses fences, just barbed wire fences. We don't like. I mean, we have very clayey soils, no stones to remove from the fields, nothing like that. So it's mostly just barbed wire.
Yeah. Now, the hedgerows, as my understanding, are pretty much specific to certain areas of northern France and into England and such. Because after you get out of those areas, again, you don't have as much free-growing vegetation. So the more open areas and barbed wire fences, pretty much,
Essentially, once you enter the Seine Valley, it's flat mostly.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit hilly, but no stony soils, nothing like that.
Yeah. Now, another thing I think that's interesting is there's a second landing in France that most people completely forget ever occurred, and that's the Anvil Dragoon landings in the southern portion of France.
Yeah, my side.
Yeah, and they get ashore fairly easily. The Germans almost immediately say, "Nah, we're not going to really resist this," and it's a series of delaying actions up through the mountains and the Central Massif, and the Germans do a good job of delaying that advance, and it affords them plenty of time to get most of their troops safely out of southern France. So again, it's a case of where you land and how you land and what the opposition is going to do that makes all the difference. And I think that's one of the key issues in Normandy, is that they know that once they get there, that hedgerow country works two ways. So it makes it really difficult for the Germans to counterattack and throw them back off the beaches. But at the same time, it makes the Allied problem of breaking out of the peninsula a complicated affair as well.
Yeah. That takes.
Yeah, it makes it very slow to progress, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's what it does. You're not going to gain much land in a day. It's going to be literally one field at a time.
Yeah, part of the solution that the Allies come up with trying to achieve that breakout from Normandy is they reallocate the strategic bomber force, the B-17s and B-24s and such, and they do a very condensed carpet bombing of a sector of the front. And the idea is to completely pulverize the German defenses in that sector of the front, so the ground forces can get through without having to fight through all of that kind of bad terrain and opposition. There isn't very good coordination between the air forces and the ground forces. And the first time they attempt it, they actually carpet bomb their own troops. And the highest ranking Allied casualty of the entire war occurs by friendly fire during that carpet bombing.
Oof.
Yeah. So it I think shows how the terrain really dictates the course of ground operations. You get this slow slog through the hedgerow country and the Normandy Peninsula. Then you get the breakout, and suddenly it's open field running, and the Germans don't even make much of a defensive attempt along the Seine, which was originally their plan, because their forces are so heavily depleted. They don't really stop until they get to the Rhine. And then it becomes another case of everybody's going to stop, and the Allies have to solve their logistical problems, which affords the Germans time to solve and reorganize their equipment and personnel losses. And then you have this big operation to try to get across the Rhine. That's where you get Market Garden and such, the famous bridge too far.
Yeah, the battle for Pegasus Bridge, all that.
Yeah,
there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, is that the terrain really makes a key point. And if you start looking at other areas that the Allies could have landed in, from that standpoint, there's an argument that could be made. I don't agree with it, but I've seen people make the argument of landing elsewhere where there wasn't such good defensive terrain, would have allowed the Allies to liberate much of France earlier, because the Germans wouldn't have had good terrain to defend on. At the same time, the flip side is also true. It doesn't afford the Allies good defensive terrain to prevent the German counterattack from driving all the way to the beaches. So again, I would contend that Normandy was indeed the right place to do those landings.
Yes, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. We don't know how the other ways would have panned out. We know how this panned out. It was successful. So it was definitely the right decision to make. One of the other decisions, now in hindsight, we might think that may have been a better decision, but until that played out, we don't know. This one worked.
Exactly.
Yeah. And,
I've just noticed in the chat, Raymond's put on just coming up to an hour, lads. That was 12 minutes ago.
Well, yeah.
So I don't know if we're wanting to start to wrap things up, are we? Or
yeah. So
is this the polite way of saying, Lance, shut the hell up?
No, you've been wonderful. I mean, I very much like your contribution to this conversation. I mean, you know much more detail than I do. I mean, the late part of course, the invasion and liberation of Western Europe, until it stops near the Rhine, of course, happens in my nation. Of course, Market Garden and all that. That's for a different episode. I won't touch that, but half my nation got liberated. Unfortunately, the other half had to wait till May. And then the year after that. Any things you would like to add to this conversation?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it. I think Overlord stands as one of the pivotal battles of the war. I think the Western viewpoint of, it was the critical battle in turning the course of the war. I don't think that's
it was it is the turning point, I believe, of the Second World War.
It's the turning point for the West, but the war is really won and lost in the East. Without the massive meat grinder that just grinds the German army down to nothingness against the Russians, I think the Germans could have easily had a hell of a lot more troops, better quality troops, all deployed to face an Allied landing, and it would have been a much more difficult, if not impossible, task to get a landing secure ashore. We forget when we look at the numbers of troops that are deployed on the Western Front facing the Allies, there's probably, when you add in the German Allied countries, 4 to 5 times that number fighting the Russians in the East.
Yep.
My final thought, just reminded me of this, D-Day. A lot of people have a misconception of what D-Day actually means. What does the D in D-Day stand for? Do you know?
That day, basically.
It just stands for day. There's
Yeah, and
many
then you also have H hour. H hour is the
That
initial
was-
hour
that's the
going
next one.
ashore.
So yeah, the H stands for hour, and the
Yeah.
D stands for day. There's many D days. When we used to go on exercises, certain exercises, this
Yeah.
would be D day, this would be the day. But
D-Day is the day that an operation kicks off.
yes, yeah, and D just stands for day because a lot of people think it stands for like decision day and other things, but it doesn't. It's just
And the other thing that I find interesting is how D-Day has kind of become synonymous with Operation Overlord.
yes.
And
Yes, we don't call it.
it
Operation
isn't.
Overlord. we call it D-Day.
Yeah.
It is known as D-Day. But even now, when you're taking part in military operations, it still gets referred to as D-Day because that's the day.
Yeah.
And then like you say H hour. So D just stands for day. H just stands for hour.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd bring that up because a lot of people.
I mean, if you wanted to be
Absolutely.
accurate, the thing to do is call it Operation Neptune. That is the first day landings. That's all Neptune was the first day's landings.
Yes.
And in my bucket list of things to do is definitely a visit to the beaches in Normandy. I don't live too far away from it, days drive about. So they're definitely on my bucket list. Thank you, gentlemen, for your contribution for this episode, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Take care.